Good morning and welcome. My name is Deb Gang, and I will be your service leader today. We welcome you. We know you come here for different reasons: to find community, to seek your spiritual and personal truths, to question, to nurture your heart and soul, to be nurtured, to explore new ideas, to find comfort, and perhaps to find the answers to some of your bigger questions. We welcome you. We know you come from different places, different religions, different beliefs, and different backgrounds. We hope you will find comfort, connection, challenge, and love here. We hope you will find ways to provide outreach to others here at LCUUF, in our local community, and in our world community. Our announcements were on a slideshow before the service. If you didn't see them, they will be available in tomorrow's sharing. And so I just want to welcome you with live from Fellowship Hall. It's our LCUUF Sunday service. Today's chalice lighting words are by Reverend Sarah Asher. May the light from this flame be a beacon of our faith in the days that grow dark and dreary. May the light from this flame be warmth to our spirits during nights of restless searching. May the light from this flame be a celebration of the truth, meaning, and joy we find within these walls and in our dreams. The light that we now kindle is a reminder of those who gave their lives to the freedom we cherish. May we never allow the light to falter, not in our chalice and not in our hearts. Please light your chalice.
We kindle this light in celebration for the life that we share. We kindle.
Our opening words today are by Reverend Susan Milner from Of Creeds and Covenants. What binds us together is our promise to live our values in the world. Our religion, our spirituality are of the here and now in this world. So long as any suffer, we are not whole. To agree to try to shape the world without making political correctness into a creed by which to judge all who do not conform is not an easy task. Nor is it easy to allow diversity while making a real difference in the world. But it is our task. This is our covenant, and together we walk in trust. Each week we take time to remind ourselves that we belong to a community which cares for each other. We do this by sharing any significant joys or sorrows in our lives. If you have a joy or sorrow to share today, you can type it into the chat now, and we'll read those aloud. First, let us voice our sorrows or concerns, whatever you or the world may be holding that is in need of our healing and caring thoughts. You are welcome to type sorrows and concerns in the chat box.
We have a concern from Lynn Cleek, who would like to light a candle in silence, please. Please light a candle from Heidi, who says, I have a concern for a dear friend who is struggling with some very serious family issues. Please light a candle for Sue Kelly, who says, I have a concern for Kelly's health. That's it for the concerns.
Now let us recall the joys, whatever you may be celebrating, whatever evokes a feeling of joy or peace for yourself and others. You are welcome to type joys in the chat box.
A joy from Liz and Matt, who say that their good friend Mark in North Carolina has been accepted into a treatment study group at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. It's very encouraging news for a serious diagnosis. From Sue Kelly, she shares, last night, my niece, Lindsay, graduated from Oklahoma State University with a master's and a doctorate in medicine. She now heads to Lawton, Oklahoma to do a 3-year residency. We have a joy from Robert Barnett, who says, happy belated birthday last Friday to my beloved wife, Pat. From Doug Mattoon, he shares, my mother, who had a low opinion of her family, always told me, you can't pick your family, but you can pick your friends. Today, I found out I had picked my friends well because they saved me from a very desperate situation in Mexico City. Not a good place in which to be desperate. Another joy from Robert Barnett, who says, we celebrated a joyous 44th anniversary of our wedding the week before. A joy from Kathy Coaches, who says, please light a candle of joy for Karen Carpenter, who is back home in Ajijic, reunited with Annie, and is doing well. That's it.
And this candle from our care team represents those sorrows that are too raw, too difficult for us to share aloud. So many of us have had losses, partners, children, grandchildren, losses that remain present with us every day. So many of us have burdens, anger, fear, and frustration. All of those things that weigh heavy on our hearts. We will light this candle for all those unspoken sorrows.
today's service, I wanted to find a Universalist hymn I thought would be easy. Well, not so much. A Google search led me to a blog on hymns on universal salvation, and here there was a reference to the very same inquiry to Reverend Scott Wells by one Reverend Eric Posa. The question posed was, on another hymnody issue, is there anything in singing the living tradition that you especially like to complement preaching on universalism? Any advice you can offer on hymns would be appreciated. Reverend Wells' response was, that's going to be a tough one. Universalists, for all their strengths, did not have the best cadre of hymn writers and tended to, 1, write rather badly didactic hymns, and 2, use the best of others had to offer. Plus, Universalists generally had a higher Christology and weren't so squeamish to talk about Christ's divine nature and the purpose of his sacrifice. Reverend Scott listed 5 suggested hymns on universal salvation, only 2 of which are in our abridged version of Singing Living Traditions. Those hymns were Immortal Loss and God of Grace and God of Glory. So I chose God of Grace and God of Glory for today. Yes.
Our reading today is an excerpt from the sermon New Wine and Old Bottles by Reverend Brainerd F. Gibbons, written in 1949. While fully aware of its Christian heritage, many equally sincere Universalists maintain that an inherent spirit of inquiry has carried Universalism beyond Christianity. A new type of Universalism is proclaimed, which shifts the emphasis on universal salvation from salvation to religion, and describes universalism as boundless in scope, as broad as humanity, and as infinite as the universe. Is this universalism's answer a religion not exclusively Christian or any other named brand, but a synthesis of all religious knowledge which passes the test of human intelligence, a truly universal religion? Every Universalist realizes that universalism has changed considerably since the days of its New England forebears, and many Christian dogmas have been gradually supplanted. Even the sketchiest summary reveals the vast differences between then and now. Divine revelation has been replaced by human investigation, ignorance by knowledge, superstition by reason, the closed mind by the open, stagnation by progress, celestial nonsense by common sense. Hence, Universalists today consider all religions, including Christianity, expressions of human spiritual aspirations, not God-founded institutions. The Bible, a marvelous work of man, not the miraculous handiwork of God. Jesus was a spiritual leader, not a divine savior. Man's fate in human hands, not supernatural clutches. Faith, the projection of known facts into the unknown, not blind creedal acceptance. The supernatural, merely the natural beyond man's present understanding, not a violation of nature's laws.
Which way is... Good morning. I was raised Unitarian Universalist, but the churches I was most associated with have been Universalist churches. I've always wanted to know more about how the Universalists went from being one of the largest denominations to what the Unitarian Universalist Church is today. And that is what inspired me to research and write this presentation. We Unitarian Universalists stand on broad, bold, and some pretty radical shoulders. Today's talk tells half that story, the story of the Universalists. It's the late 1700s, somewhere in rural hills of eastern United States. It's the end of the day. Wind is howling, portending much needed rain. It's cold and it's dark. A haggard, tired-looking couple sits at a table. One lonely candle lights the small cabin. There's barely enough light to read from their Bible, a nightly practice after a long day, working on their small farm. They practice Calvinism, which requires devotion to 5 principles: total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. Like most of their Calvinist neighbors, they believe they were probably among the saved. To prove it, they worked hard, behaved well, read the Bible, and obeyed the laws of their town. Now, this may have led to stable communities. However, there was the fear of the unknown. What if they were not among those to be saved in the afterlife, but were preordained to be among the damned? No amount of devotion, no amount of hard work, no amount of prayer would change the outcome. It had to have been an overwhelming weight on the shoulders of these farmers struggling to survive day after day. John Burens, former president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, wrote about this fear in his History of Unitarian Universalism. It's hard for modern readers to understand the deep fear of being excluded from heaven. Under the influence of the Calvinist revivalism of the Great Awakening in the 18th century, many good people trembled over the idea of being sent to hell and being deprived of communion with God and with their deceased loved ones. When they argued over whether a loving God would send people to an eternal hell, they argued over competing interpretations of the Bible. Yikes. Again, yikes. Work hard, accept limited atonement, pray, 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 and maybe you've been chosen for heaven, or maybe not. If ever there was an opening for a biblical interpretation and practice, assuring hope and salvation as an alternative to the fatalism of Calvinism, it was now, and it came in the form of universalism. In short, universalism is the belief that it's God's purpose to save every individual from sin through divine grace revealed in Jesus. The doctrine is old, but no organized body of believers took it as a distinctive feature of their church until at this time in America. Enter John Murray, most frequently cited as the founder of the Universalist denomination in the United States. John Murray was an English Calvinist, a Trinitarian, and a prolific preacher. However, as fate would have it, he crossed paths with one Reverend John Relly, an English Unitarian minister who was beginning to preach universalism, and wrote a treatise on it. It was Calvinist John Murray's intent to argue against Relly's work. The deeper he read Relly in his work and his preaching, the more he realized the truth could be found in universalism. And rather than refuting Relly's work, he became a convert. However, at this point, Murray's life took a tragic turn. His wife and only child became sick and died. Unable to pay medical bills, he ended up in a pauper's jail. When he was released, he swore he would never preach again and decided to sail to America and start a new life. Murray's arrival in America, however, was a story of near biblical proportions, according to John Burens in his History. But first you need to know about Thomas Potter. Thomas Potter was an illiterate farmer who in 1760 built a chapel in Good Luck, New Jersey. I'm not kidding, Good Luck, New Jersey, for the purpose of spreading the doctrine of universalism. Universalist ideas, however, were not new and had been developing in small rural towns and among a number of colonial religious sects throughout New England, the West, and mid-Atlantic states for a number of years. Potter just happened to play a unique role in what became the Universalist denomination. He was born in 1689, the son of Baptist immigrants from Rhode Island, influenced by both Quaker and Baptist belief. Potter, as a Universalist, let people of all creeds worship on his land. but he remained convinced that God would send him a preacher of Universalism. As fate would have it, John Murray would be that preacher. It turns out the ship he sailed to America on ran aground near Good Luck, New Jersey. Ironic, isn't it? In the vicinity of Potter's farm. Upon meeting Potter, Murray was prevailed upon to preach, and thus, despite his vow never to do so again, gave his first Universalist sermon on the American continent. Murray continued preaching and went on to become the minister of the first Universalist congregation in America, located in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and to be a central figure in the creation of the Universalist Church in America in 1793. I actually had the honor of attending a service in that first church in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Potter died not long after Murray departed, but is still considered to be one of the founders of the Universalist movement. Universalists continued to pilgrimage to his farm and to the site of this chapel, where in 1870 they built the Potter Memorial Chapel, and in 1886 created Murray Grove as the center of Universalism. Today, Murray Grove is still a Unitarian Universalist retreat and conference center, celebrating the heritage of Potter, Murray, and all the Universalists of the day. Murray became the most widely and respected voice of American Universalism during the first 3 decades of the 18th century. A legal conflict surrounding his ministry was instrumental in undermining the monopoly of the established church in Massachusetts. Apparently then it was legal to only have one church. This was a very critical and important law case at the time. And it brought about the legal organization of the first Universalist churches in New England, which, by the way, they organized before the Unitarians as a denomination. It was his vision that led to the first moves towards uniting the various independent American Universalist movements into a single denomination. This was an exciting time to be a Universalist and to not be a Calvinist. While serving pulpits in Gloucester and Boston, he traveled frequently to Philadelphia and the mid-Atlantic states, being for a long time the only point of contact between Universalists there and in New England. Murray moved in distinguished circles of the East in Boston, which brought much needed respectability and a sense of self-respect to a denomination comprised largely of shopkeepers and middling farmers. For this, and for his work organizing the denomination into the Universalist Church of America, which held its first General Assembly in 1793 in Philadelphia, he is rightfully called the father of Universalism in America. During the first half of the 19th century, the newly organized Universalists established churches in small farming communities throughout the Midwest, as well as the Mid-Atlantic and New England. Reverend Kevin Carson, in a sermon given at the First Universalist Parish in Chester, Vermont, best described this period of emergence and growth of the Universalist Church. He said, with its hopeful message of God's inexhaustible love and universal salvation, the Universalist Church of America attracted many converts away from the prevailing dismal Calvinism in the colonies. And after the Revolution, it would experience a prodigious period of growth and church planting, especially in rural America. Universalist ministers spread out on horseback from the deep south, the backwoods of New England, and into the Midwest. And by the onset of the Civil War, it was estimated there were perhaps as many as 600,000 Universalists in America, roughly about 10% of the population. Though merger was still over a century away, most Universalist ministers during this period were also Unitarian in their theology. Not all Unitarians were pleased with this. Many Unitarian clergy saw Universalism as less intellectually vigorous and irrational, and were very classist in their opinion. The famous Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing, whose 1819 sermon on the Unitarian Christianity which helped define Unitarian movement, Channing once described the growth of Universalism as the most threatening moral evil in our part of the country. Wow. Perhaps there was a hint of jealousy at the Universalist success. At this time, a second great voice began to rise and over time became the most influential force in the denomination through the mid-19th century, and like Murray, is considered a founder of the Universalist Church. Hosea Ballou preached his liberal faith to everyday people, men and women of laboring classes. He was self-educated from rural New Hampshire and Massachusetts and was spurned by the Boston Unitarian elite. Thanks to Ballou, however, by the end of the 19th century, 1 out of every 8 Americans called themselves a Universalist. He was an author, a public lecturer, an itinerant preacher, editor of various Universalist journals, including Universalist Magazine, and the minister of the Second Universalist Society of Boston, another church I had the honor of attending a service in. He was at the Church of Boston for a quarter of a century until his death in 1952. Hosea Ballou's most important theological work, his treatise on atonement, is the work that defined theology as science and human experience and was critical in redefining universalism, mostly away from its Calvinistic beginnings. Unlike Murray, who was a Trinitarian, Ballou preached the use of reason in religious thinking. Ballou shifted universalism from its belief in a three-person God to a Unitarian basis that did not see God as having separate personal attributes or functions. He also discarded the doctrines of original sin and vicarious atonement, believing that Christ died not to reconcile man to God, but to demonstrate God's unchanging love for man. Ballou believed that human emotions prompt us to be both moral and immoral in our actions. So we are invited to strengthen those emotions and reap the happiness for self and others. In Ballou's words, we cannot be profitable to others unless we savor the spirit within us. Ballou believed we have a God-given right to be happy, and only when we feel this love are we truly happy. Over the course of his life, he wrote some 10,000 sermons, and, contrary to Reverend Wells' disparaging remarks about Universalist hymnology, wrote over 200 hymns. However, none of these are in our current hymnal songs of the living tradition. In fact, only one is still continuously performed by a choral group in England. I was going to include it, but it really is a dismal hymn. As the Universalist denomination expanded numerically under the influence of Ballou, it also expanded its moral and ethical footprint on American society through an advocacy of preaching and support for education, non-sectarian schools, separation of church and state, prison reform, capital punishment, the abolition of slavery, and women's rights. Let's take a little time to elaborate on some of all of this. On women's rights. In 1963, Universalists became the first religious denomination in the United States to ordain a woman, Olympia Brown, with full denominational authority. She was born in Vermont and raised by an abolitionist, education-focused family who became part of the Westward Movement, where they eventually settled in northern Michigan, and her father started schools in the region. She attended college at Antioch in Ohio, also the school of Coretta Scott King and many other famous people, which encouraged equality among men and women and was led by Unitarian Horace Mann. After Antioch, she decided she wanted to become a minister preaching Universalist theology. She enrolled and was accepted at St. Lawrence University Divinity School, the first woman accepted to the school, a Universalist-founded school, in fact. After ordination, she was called to serve in a rundown church in Vermont. In Vermont, or wherever she was called, she rebuilt rundown churches and strengthened the congregations she served. She helped rebuild churches in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and then Racine, Wisconsin. This was the plight of women pioneers in the ministry in this era. They had to take rundown churches because, of course, men wouldn't take them. Olympia Brown eventually left the ministry to devote all her efforts to support the suffragist movement and lived long enough to be one of the only original suffragists to actually get to vote. A brief shout out to Reverend Alice Diebold, who did a wonderful service on Olympia Brown, for which I borrowed some of that detail. On education, Universalists, including both Hosea Ballou, the founder, and his great-nephew, who was also integrally involved in the Universalist movement, were vigorous proponents of higher learning, whose programs would include training of ministers. In fact, the majority of the Universalist leadership saw that an increasingly well-educated laity required an increasingly well-educated clergy. Makes sense. A fundraising drive to establish a college was inaugurated. The result was Tufts University, for which Hosea Ballou, the nephew, was the first president. Interesting side note, Universalist P.T. Barnum, of P.T. Barnum fame, was a founding and lifelong contributor to Tufts. Eventually, Universalists were responsible for establishing St. Lawrence University, where Olympia Brown got her divinity degree. Lombard University, Bucktel College, Ryder Divinity School, which was later incorporated into Meadville Theological School, and Smithson College. Temperance was another issue the Universalists took on. Leaders such as Hosea Ballou and Horace Greeley worked for temperance, preaching, lecturing, writing, organizing temperance societies, and eventually advocated for prohibition and abstinence. They even convinced the exuberant P.T. Barnum to moderate, then advocate for abstinence. Well, everything the Universalists did wasn't always great. On prison reform was an equally important issue for Universalist reformers, including Benjamin Rush, an original signer of the Declaration. Though he wasn't technically a Universalist, he was associated with many of the Universalist preachings and actions of the day. They preached that all people, including criminals, were members of one human family and worthy of salvation, not only in this world, but the next. This included the abolition of the death penalty. Now, finally, on abolition. The Universalist Church was, of course, a driving force along with the Unitarian Church of the day. In fact, it's one of the few issues of that day on which the two churches could actually agree. However, there is not enough time today to elaborate on their role in abolition of slavery, as honestly it is a separate topic and a separate service altogether. These mid-century Universalists and congregations they served laid the groundwork for the social activism of the Unitarian Universalist Church we know and experience today. So, how did we get from a dominant denomination to where we are today? There were multiple factors at work, beginning with the Civil War, which unfortunately destroyed many Universalist churches and killed many Universalist ministers who served as army chaplains. The most generally accepted factor seems to be the late 19th century, a softer approach to the idea of damnation became popular throughout the United States, making the Universalist denomination less unique in its teachings. Ken Vincent of the Christian Universalist Association explains it more clearly. The decline of Universalist Church as an independent denomination is most often attributed to the success of its doctrine of God loves for all. When other denominations began to acknowledge the power of this hopeful and inclusive message, they were motivated to moderate their emphasis on hellfire and brimstone and predestination. Consequently, parishioners who embraced the Universalist view in theology could remain in their traditional congregations rather than relocate to a Universalist church. Rural Universalist churches were hurt by the migration to the cities. In the tiny Universalist churches throughout America, like those the itinerant preachers set up in Western Ohio, for example, they were devastated by the Depression. Another factor may be that the Universalist Church became more liberal in its theology. Though declining in numbers in the early 20th century, the Universalist Church expanded its theology of inclusiveness and social activism through one of its last great influencers, the Reverend Clarence Skinner. Beginning in 1900 up to his death in 1949, Skinner was a voice of new Universalism and is considered to be the most important figure in Universalism and Unitarianism from the first half of the century to this date. He advocated a religion of humanity which lifts every individual and every aspect of culture into a unified whole, in which race, creeds, science, and beauty are integrated into harmony, in which partial experience gives way to universal experience. Clearly, these are the foundations of our 7 principles. Skinner foresaw a radical religion which would repudiate the exclusiveness of historical religions and move forward from the authoritarianism to a more free-thinking theology, from limited insight to an understanding of that which unites and binds us all, which lays at the heart of a free-thinking faith, wherever it's found. The social activism of the Universalist Clarence Skinner eventually found expression in the community church movement, which essentially sought to transform religious congregations into non-sectarian agencies for transforming society itself. Clarence Skinner became the great originator of not only modern Universalism, but Unitarianism as well. It was Skinner that the two churches found a oneness that shaped and evolved into the Unitarian Universalist Association. He is historically credited with developing all that Universalism and Unitarianism is now. But he was too far ahead of his times, even in the 20s, and we still are working to achieve all that Skinner thought possible, even today. Though more liberalized, and some would say radicalized, the denomination continued to lose membership. After growing increasingly theologically and ethically close, the Universalists and the Unitarian denominations consolidated in 1961 to form the new religion of Unitarian Universalism. Unitarian Universalism no longer solely holds traditional Universalist or Unitarian beliefs, but does draw directly on its heritage for much of its inspiration, spirituality, and grounding. I close with the same words we opened today's service with, from Reverend Susan Milner, as they embrace Skinner's Universalism. What binds us together is our promise to live our values in the world. Our religion, our spirituality, are all here and now in this world. So long as any suffer, we are not whole. To agree to shape the world without making political correctness into a creed by which to judge all who do not conform is not an easy task, nor is it easy to allow diversity while making a real difference in the world. But it is our task. This is our covenant, and together we walk in trust. May it be so.
This is the time in our service when we ask that you remember that we share our gifts here through pledging and donations. We are not meeting in person now, but our connections to each other and our contributions to the community continue. Instructions for payments to the fellowship are on a slide during the announcements before the service every week. And while you are considering your gifts to the fellowship, remember that each month LCUUF donates 5,000 pesos or more to an organization providing food aid in our lakeside community. For the month of May, we will be supporting Tepewa. The Tepewa neighborhood is situated on the hillside above downtown Chapala. It is considered one of the poorest neighborhoods in the state of Jalisco. Your donations will help support the community center, which is working to help the people of Tepewa stand on their own. When you pledge, please add something to share the basket as you used to place pesos in our physical basket. You can donate in the same way that you pay your pledge, but please donate Share the Basket separately or indicate what part of your donation is for Share the Basket. Your offerings are greatly received. Let us extinguish our chalices with these words, which we read together. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we keep in our hearts and share with all the world.
Our closing words today are often attributed to John Murray, but were most likely spoken by Alfred Storer Cole, who sought to express the message John Murray heard from the Universalist societies he was seeking to unite. He said, "Go out into the highways and byways of America, your new country. Give the people, blanketed with decaying and crumbling Calvinism, something of your new vision. You may possess only a small light, but uncover it. Let it shine. Use it in order to bring more light and understanding to the hearts and minds of all. Give them not hell, but hope and courage. Do not push them deeper into their theological despair, but preach the kindness and everlasting love of God." Okay. Our postlude today is another special selection. The lyrics, set to Finlandia, music written by John Sibelius, were written by Unitarian minister Samuel Anthony Wright for the Unitarian and Universalist youth at their Continental Convention in 1953 to 54. As Jackie James notes in between the lines, at this conference, the youth merged to form the Liberal Religious Youth of the United States. This is a group I grew up in Canada, setting a model for the Unitarian Universalist denominational consolidation in 1961. We would be one indeed.
singing our hymn of love to pledge ourselves anew to that high cause of greater understanding of who we are and what in us is true. We would be one in living for each other, to show to all a new community. We would be one in building for tomorrow a nobler world than we have known today. We would be one in searching for that meaning which binds our hearts and points us on our way. As one we pledge ourselves to greater service, with love and justice strive to make us free. Oh, make us free.
Please stay around if you like for discussion.
Who's that one?
Well, it looks like it might still be a little cool in Santa Fe.
We got lime and quarter-sized hail.
Hi, Lorna.
Hail?
Hello.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it's
Gardens.
Darcy
really cool.
here.
I see. Rudy, I just
Hold
sent
on.
you a chat for joys and
Hey, Ellen.
concerns.
Oh, and you know what, Kathy? I messed up, but fortunately, Colleen is going to pick it up. I thought Colleen wasn't going to be here today. And what can I say?
Shall I send it to Colleen?
She
Yes,
can see it because you,
I can't.
oh no, yeah, Kathy,
Yeah.